I did not fall because of a loose ribbon or a slick floor. I fell because a foot I knew as well as my own hooked my ankle in the narrow hallway behind the curtain and sent me forward onto my palms hard enough that the sting traveled up to my elbows. I heard the stage manager call the 5-minute warning and the junior tap line counting in whispers, and over it all I heard my father lean close with that polite smile he wears for ushers and church greeters and say, soft and amused, "Now they match your life." And he let out a short laugh like he had rehearsed that line earlier in the car and finally found a place to use it. I got up because the lights would rise with or without me, and I decided in that moment not to give him the scene he wanted. I decided to give the audience the show they paid for and keep the shaking in my legs a private conversation between me and the floor. My name is Tessa Vaughn. I am 24 years old, and this began on the first Saturday of June at the Edison High School auditorium 8 miles outside of Dayton, in a brick building that smells like eucalyptus cleaner and old programs that have lived too long in cardboard boxes. I had come early to roll out my hamstrings on a tennis ball, to retape my 2 stubborn toes, and to sip lukewarm coffee from the paper cup Zoe handed me when we parked by the flagpole, because she knows I forget breakfast on performance days. And I had smiled at the girls in sequins who still think hairspray is a magic spell, and told them to pin their headpieces one more time because the parade of mothers with cameras would catch every wobble and turn it into a story. The hallway to the wings is narrow and runs alongside a row of lockers that never open anymore, and I was halfway down it, counting the 8 that leads into the first phrase of my solo, when my father stepped out from a darkened doorway pretending to read a poster about emergency exits, and then his shoe slid behind my heel with surgical certainty, and my hands met the varnish with a sound that popped like a small firecracker in a tin can. I tasted dust. I blinked twice. I stood up because standing is muscle memory where I am from. He tilted his head and used a tone that would sound like concern to anyone more than 4 feet away and said, "Careful there, kiddo. Nervous feet get tangled." And I tied my ribbon tighter with fingers that would not stop shaking and walked around him without answering, because if I answered, I would say the thing the evening could not hold. I opened the recital with a solo that is supposed to look effortless and light, and I made it look like that by drawing every landing up through the ribcage and keeping my smile in the top half of my face while I counted my breath with the steadiness you learn when the floor does not give you what you asked for. And I let my left ankle take only what it had to and my right do the heavy lifting while the audience clapped at the safe places and the man in the sound booth mouthed along to the piano as though the speakers needed help. I walked off as evenly as I had walked on, slid into my warm-ups, and pressed a bag of ice wrapped in a towel against the swelling just above the ankle bone while Miss Patty, who owns the studio and balances her checkbook on instinct and prayer, told me I had done exactly what needed doing. My mother arrived in the doorway with a program folded into quarters that she kept smoothing flat with the heel of her hand, and when her eyes landed on the ice she said in the tone she uses for church committee disputes, the one that pretends at neutrality, "You should sit out the pas de deux if there is any question at all," and my father, who had somehow drifted back into the performers-only zone like rules were a suggestion backed by a weak fence, added, "No shame in knowing your limits. That's what separates grown-ups from show-offs." I told Zoe to take my place in the second act and she nodded because she reads the air faster than I do, and I smiled for the photos after the bows because the parents in our town paid $20 for tickets and expect to paste proof onto the fridge. And in the third picture my father's hand sits just above my elbow with a weight that would look like affection to anyone who never had to negotiate it. At home the baseball game was already on because that is what happens in June in a household that uses innings to space out conversations, and the announcer was talking about a rookie's control like control is a virtue you either inherit or you don't. and the kitchen smelled like coffee that had been cooking since morning and fried chicken reheated once too often. I took 2 ibuprofen with tap water that tasted metallic and set my phone face down on the counter because the texts were all ready. Arriving girls from the younger classes cheering me on, a mother asking if I felt faint in the hallway, Zoe's line of question marks that said, "Do you want to talk?" without spelling it out. My father turned the TV volume up 1 notch to make the room bend toward the game and told me he hoped I had learned something about pacing and about how doing less at the right time saves you from embarrassment later. And I said that I had learned you can be pushed without falling inside where it counts, and my mother shot me a look that asked me to keep the temperature down 2 degrees for the sake of the house. Sunday meant the second service at church because the first is for families with little kids and the third is for people who like guitar, and we sit in the middle where the hymns still live and the sopranos keep trying for the high notes. The sermon was about pride and the way it sneaks in the back door while you are busy watching the front, and the pastor told an old story about a man who thought he could carry more than he could, and I wanted to laugh, but did not because laughing would have become something else. In the narthex, my father shook hands and promised a small discount on mulch to 2 men with lawn trucks if they came by the store before Thursday. And at the car, my mother turned the vents toward her ankles and told me to remember Aunt Denise was coming for lunch and to wear a skirt that covered my knees because she did not want to have to field questions about bruises. The second Monday of June, right after I taught plies to a line of 8-year-olds in flower headbands and answered the same question about whether glitter is allowed in the dressing room 3 different ways so mothers would feel heard, I took the studio's paper checks to County Bank because Miss Patty prefers not to keep too much cash in the office, and on impulse, I asked the teller if I could get a statement on the education CD my grandmother opened in my name when I was 17. The one she used to mention each Thanksgiving like a promise with a bow. The teller glanced at her screen and went to get a manager who brought out a printed note that said the account had been closed the previous spring and the funds transferred to a business account at a different bank. And the way she kept her voice calm told me she had been in this exact scene before with other families. My mouth went dry the way it does when a dentist blows air on your teeth. I thanked her because the bank did not need the kind of drama that bottles and reruns. And I sat in my car in the parking lot with the engine off and watched a man haul 5 bags of mulch into a sedan while I counted backward from 50 to 10, and then I drove home without the radio because I needed to hear what my breath was doing. At dinner, while the local news teased a story about a water main break on the south side and my mother set down a bowl of green beans steamed just to the edge of soft, I placed the printout by my plate and said I had checked on Grandma's CD and learned that it was gone. And I asked which business account had needed it so badly that it skipped past the promise she had said in writing. My father did not flinch or apologize. He explained in the careful tone he uses for customers who come in on the wrong day that winter had been tight, that payroll arrives like a clock you cannot unplug, that roofs do not patch themselves with good intentions, and that family money stays in the family even when it moves around. And I said that a promise with my name on it is not supposed to become a general fund with no plan for its return. And he said the plan had been spring when the soil thaws and people buy, but spring had not cooperated the way forecasts had suggested. My mother held her fork like she was protecting it from the table and stared at the weather map as if the colors could translate what none of us would name out loud. On Thursday, the day the local AM station repeats that there might be storms after 3, and keep an eye on those gutters, folks, I walked from the studio to the Chamber of Commerce office with my ankle taped and my questions typed in my notes app, so I would remember to ask them the way the clerk would require. The lobby used to be a bank and still smells like pennies, lemon cleanser, and paper that has been filed too many times. I asked, with a voice I kept low and even, for minutes from any meeting where my name might have been discussed as a scholarship candidate and for copies of communications sent about me to any committee members. The receptionist slid a brochure across the counter without making eye contact and said the committee was private and that general questions could be directed to a shared email address that did not have a person attached to it. And I placed my finger on the brochure to keep it from sliding away and saw my father's store logo under Gold Supporters with a gold star sticker pressed beside it like a second-grade chart. And I felt a hard click at the base of my ribs that might as well have been a knuckle. I walked outside, sat on the concrete step where the heat bakes up through your jeans, and texted Miss Patty to ask who sat on the youth committee this year, and she replied with first names only, no last names. The way people do when they have to share a truth that might come back around and ask where it came from. The Friday before payday, which is the day cashiers in our town can feel tension in the air like humidity, my father grilled chicken on the porch and made conversation with the neighborhood like nothing required a raised eyebrow. He said that committees have processes and people who try to go around them end up making fools of themselves, and I told him an email from his store domain had landed at the chamber and summarized episodes I had not had. And he smiled in that way that wants to be read as wisdom and said emails can be spoofed. I reminded him that his boot in a hallway cannot. And he took a long sip of sweet tea and asked if I planned to make us a subject of gossip all summer or whether I would settle down and take a local job that solved actual problems. The next morning was the neighborhood garage sale day when every other driveway sprouts folding tables before 7 and people loop in cars at 10 miles an hour with travel mugs and bills folded into the pocket of their shorts. I set out 3 old costumes. A box of dance magazines, leotards grouped by size, and a hand-lettered sign that said Moving Fund, and people paused, smiled, and spent because our town likes to purchase small pieces of your life as a way of telling you it saw you. Standing there. Around 9, a white sedan with the city seal pulled up and a man with a laminated badge asked to see my temporary permit, since a concerned neighbor had wondered if unpermitted retail activity was happening. And even though the permit was taped to my sign with blue painter's tape, he wrote my name in a small notebook and reminded me that certain categories of goods require separate rules, and I told him I had tutus, magazines, and a ceramic frog and nothing with a plug, and he nodded, waved to my father across the yard like they'd met at Rotary, and left me feeling like I had been inspected and passed by an inch. Zoe showed up with sunscreen and the kind of hug you give when your mother has advised distance, and Aunt Denise arrived with a canvas tote from which she slid a stack of old Recital DVDs and told me to check the bottom later. The tote turned out to hold a small spiral notebook that used to live in my grandmother's kitchen drawer, and on the 3rd page she had written Tessa, Education CD 2015, $3, 500 initial, add $500 birthdays, with my father's name beside custodian and the handwriting made my throat go tight because it was neater than any of this felt. The second Monday of June ended with a sharp little crescendo I did not see coming. After dinner, my father called the non-emergency police line for a wellness check because he said I had made threats about legal action and sounded unstable at the table. And 2 officers stood on our porch under the yellow bug bulb at 8:30 while neighborhood sprinklers ticked on and off in rotation and asked me to confirm my name, age, and whether I was a danger to myself. I told them I was not. I told them I was angry and clear and intended to make phone calls in the morning, and that was the beginning and the end of it, and the older one gave me a card with hotline numbers because the script requires it, and they left with small nods of relief that this would not be the call that kept them late. My father shut the door and told me in a calm voice that this was what responsible parents do when a child makes rash choices, and I told him he had used the police to write a story that made him look compassionate and me look unwell. And he said the town believes what it sees and that I ought to remember that, and I went in my room and packed a bag and drove to Miss Patty's sister's house because she had texted earlier, couch is free if you need it, and I needed it. I lay under a clicking ceiling fan that counted to 5 the same way over and over and typed a new list in my phone with the title Plan Version 1, and under it I wrote long lines about dates and copies and allies who still answer when the phone rings. And I slept like a person who has put the first 3 boxes on the bottom of a stack and decided the weight can sit there until morning. By the 3rd Wednesday of June, I had filed a written records request at City Hall with the exact phrasing the reference librarian at the public library had quietly slid to me on a sticky note, the kind that unlocks a drawer you did not know existed. I learned that the chamber had accepted a small municipal grant this year, which pulled some of their committee minutes into daylight, and the clerk told me with a straight face that if such minutes existed, they would be provided during business hours after review for personal information, which is a tidy way of saying wait your turn. That afternoon, while I was sweeping rosin dust from the studio floor and listening to the AM station report on a minor fender bender at the 4-way stop by the grocery store, Miss Patty told me 2 parents had asked if I planned to bring drama into class, which meant my July hours would shrink by a third, and I felt that tight pressure at my temples that arrives when math and July and rent try to sit on the same chair. I told her I understood because the studio cannot become a battleground, and she pressed a box of paper clips into my hand the way a friend who does not like grand gestures still finds something to give. That night I sat at Aunt Denise's kitchen table over iced tea that sweated onto a circle of paper towel and showed her the banknote and the spiral notebook and the list of first names from the committee. And she opened a folder she had kept under her sink since my grandmother's funeral and pulled out a copy of a letter written in my grandmother's careful hand addressed to my father 2 summers before she died, stating plainly that the CD was for my education and not to be used for household or business, no matter how the winter goes, and that if circumstances required a conversation, she wanted Denise to remind him of the moral purpose. I felt a steadiness return to the space between my ribs as if a small level had finally found even. And I told her I would wait for the clerk's envelope and choose my next move in print rather than at a kitchen counter where the baseball announcer can be used as a soundtrack for doubt. On the first Monday of July, I signed for a manila envelope at the clerk's window with the kind of steady hand I used to save for exams, and the clerk slid it across the counter like a plate he didn't want to drop and said, in that precise tone public employees practice, that responsive materials were included and personal information had been redacted where required. And the papers smelled faintly like toner and the lemon cleaner they use in that old building to keep the past from getting sticky. I didn't wait until I got home. I sat in my car with the AC blowing hot air that turned cool only after a minute, and I spread the packet on my lap and read the minutes that said the Education/Youth Committee had convened on the 2nd Tuesday of June with 5 members present, and a vote was taken to rescind local support for candidate TV due to reputational risk, and beside the list of attendees sat my father's name without an asterisk or a note that he had stepped out. I read the summary of discussion twice because my face had gone hot and I needed my eyes to be more useful than my skin. It said, Von assures accuracy of private family info and concerns about stability, fainting episode, panic. And the 2 printed emails that followed included one from his store's domain with bullet points about my episodes, and one from the chair thanking him for his candor and suggesting discretion. I put my palm flat on the page because sometimes you need to feel the drag of pulp to make sure you're not reading with a fever, and then I texted Aunt Denise a single line that said, got them, and she wrote back, I'm home. The tea is cold. Like she was reminding me how to come in the front door without tripping over the rug. When I walked into Aunt Denise's kitchen, the window over her sink was cracked an inch and let in the hum of the cicadas and a thread of air that still felt like bathwater. And she slid a glass across the table so the sweating would start while we looked for a place to begin. I read the key lines out loud because you hear different things when your throat gets involved, and she sat very still with both hands on the tabletop like a person bracing against a wave and said, "No recusal," in a voice that didn't rise and didn't break. I told her the clerk had made me sign for the pages like I was borrowing a book that came with responsibility, and she told me that was fair because paper is heavy once it starts telling the truth, and then we called the number on the chamber flyer. Youth Initiative's breakfast, July 9th, and confirmed that the event was open to the public and there would be time for comments from the floor. "Don't you torch anything," Anthony said without smiling. "You walk in with a kitchen timer, you set it on the table, and you talk until the bell hits, and then you sit down," and the way she said it steadied my breathing better than counting did. I drove home with the packet tucked under my arm like a folder of choreography, and I put it under my bed, because that was the safest place I had that didn't involve locking it in someone else's desk. The house smelled like reheated spaghetti, and the TV announcer was discussing a pitcher's ability to calm himself, and my mother met my eyes for the first time in days and asked me if I had eaten, and I told her I'd had tea at Denise's, and that tea counts a little. On the second Tuesday of July, I walked into the community center with a folder against my ribs and shoes that didn't ask my ankle to do anything silly. And the room smelled like coffee that had been poured too early and scrambled eggs that had cooled on a long table under a plastic lid, and the walls were the same beige as every lunchroom I have ever been in. The chair of the chamber stood in front with a projector that clicked on and off when the screensaver fought him, and my father took a spot 2 seats from the front with his public smile and his hands folded to look industrious. And I sat 1 row back from people I only know by face, the daycare owner who writes her checks with a flourish, the man who coaches JV baseball and has calluses on his ring finger from swinging bats at the sporting goods aisle to check balance. When the chair asked for comments from youth serving partners, I stood, not too fast, not dramatic, just as if I had a question about the price of parking, and I said my name, and I said the name of the studio where I teach. And I thanked them for the fall grant that kept 6 kids in tap shoes, and then I said I had received minutes and emails through a lawful request showing a committee member speaking at length about a family applicant and then participating in a vote to rescind support. And I held up the packet and said I had brought copies for anyone who wanted to read exactly what I had read. I didn't name him because the point wasn't spectacle. The point was process. "I'm asking for a written conflict of interest policy that covers scholarships," I said, and I set my folded kitchen timer on the edge of the table and let 1 minute tick like a metronome that had learned to behave, and then I sat down. It took about 5 seconds for air to move in that room. Someone coughed. A saucer hit a cup wrong, a chair leg scraped, and then the daycare owner raised her hand and said she, too, had questions about sponsors advocating for their own kids, and maybe it would be good to have rules where everyone can see them, and a man I didn't know said that transparency helps everyone keep their dignity. And the chair nodded like a person who had been handed the shape of his next week's work. We were not out the door before my father came up on my left and said, "Quiet enough that it would not carry. You think this makes you look brave. It makes you look ungrateful," and I kept my eyes on the coffee urns because they were shiny and mindless and said, "It's paper, not a performance. It's dates and lines," and the daycare owner stepped right between us and looked past him to me and said, "If you have extra copies, I'd like one for my files," and she did it with the smoothness of a person who helps toddlers share a toy truck, and he smiled with all his teeth and said to her, "Good to see you," like nothing here required language we didn't already own. I walked out to the parking lot with my folder under my arm and my pulse busy at my wrists, and by the time I reached my car, my phone buzzed with a text from Caleb at the paper that said, "Someone in the room says minutes exist. Would you be willing to share for a process piece?" And I wrote back, "Documents are public. Use them," and he asked for a quote, and I told him, no quote, just accuracy, because the last thing I needed was my voice used as seasoning. The next day, the paper ran a short item in the middle of the second page under a photo of a dog adoption event. It said the chamber would review its policy on conflicts at a special meeting prompted by citizen comments, and that minutes for several subcommittee meetings had been made available at City Hall, and it did not use my name, which is exactly how I wanted it. The escalation came in small sideways hits more than punches. Two parents at the studio asked Miss Patty if I planned to discuss family matters with their children, and she told them the children were learning to count to 8 and no other topics would be covered. But she still had to cut my July hours by another slot because one mother who handles the PDA's newsletter didn't want distraction to become a theme, and the math of it pressed at my temples the way heat does. Zoe texted Les. When I asked if she wanted to get iced coffee, she said her mother needed the car. When I asked if she wanted to come over and look at apartment listings, she said maybe next week and added a heart. And I told myself people can love you and also be afraid of catching your trouble like a summer cold. My father called our insurance agent and removed me from his car policy, which meant I had to pay the difference on my own out of a budget that already needed stretching like dough. And he did it in a way that let him say later he was encouraging me to stand on my own 2 feet. And every time he used that phrase, I saw his foot behind my heel and had to sit with my fists open until my body cooled itself down. Late that week, when the AM station said storms were finally coming after all the false alarms, a cruiser drove by slow and then stopped 2 houses up, and I felt my breath land up high as if my ribs had forgotten how to make room, and then it moved on. It shouldn't have felt like a message, but it did. On the second Thursday of July, the special meeting happened in a side room at the community center that smelled like floor cleaner and ghosted dodgeball, and I sat with Aunt Denise 2 rows back. And the chair read a short statement about the importance of avoiding the appearance of bias in awarding scholarships. And the board voted to reinstate the small local support for which I had qualified and adopted an interim rule that immediate family members must recuse themselves from discussions and votes concerning relatives, and they said they would publish a formal policy by August. It was brief and not dramatic and exactly what I had asked for, and my hands shook anyway because even small right things move the body around. Afterward, the chair asked me, in that delicate tone people use when they think they may have stepped on a garden snake, if I would be open to a constructive conversation about the education CD, since there seemed to be documentation that suggested intent. And I told him I would sit at a table if a neutral party sat with us, because I didn't want to be taught family lessons in rooms that had exit doors only on one side. On the way out, Mrs. Lane, the one who sells tickets at the auditorium, and had looked away the night I hit the floor, caught my elbow and asked if we could talk where the air was moving. And under the overhang, she told me she had felt someone step into the corridor the night of the recital. She had seen a foot slide where a foot shouldn't have, and she had looked away because she wanted it not to be what it was. And then she reached into her purse and handed me a small lined card with her statement in her own print. And the date. I put it with the packet because a sentence written by a person who is done being afraid weighs more than rumor. That weekend was the 4th of July celebration, Friday this year, which made the whole town act like vacation had just snuck up and tapped them on the shoulder. And I watched the parade from a spot near the pharmacy because it had shade for the first hour, and then you had to trade it for a better view. The chamber float rolled past with a banner that had the sponsor logos. My father walked beside it, handing out keychains that double as bottle openers, and waved at the crowd with that public smile that has earned him so many invitations to ribbon cuttings. A girl of about 7 in a sparkly red tutu saw me and did a small curtsy the way we teach them to, knees soft, back long. And the cheer that went through my chest had nothing to do with revenge, and everything to do with the simple fact that her headband had stayed on the way we talked about. That night the fireworks were loud enough to make dogs complain 3 streets over, and the field smelled like damp grass, citronella, and kettle corn, and I got an email on my phone from the mediator the chamber had recommended neutral. Experienced with family financial disputes, Tuesdays and Thursdays open after 2, and I felt my heart pick up like it wanted to lead, not follow, for once. I clicked reply and wrote, "Available next Tuesday. Expect 2 parties and 1 observer," and then I put my phone face down because I wanted to see where the sparks landed without a screen telling me what to think. Tuesday came with heat that pressed on the back of the neck even under the car's vent, and the mediator's office tried to look like someone's home. Soft chairs, a fern with a jaunty lean, framed prints of bridges that must have come with the furniture. She had a calm voice and a way of looking at the page while she listened that made you feel you were more than an appointment. I laid out my papers in a stack that went like this: bank printout closing the CD, my grandmother's letter in her neat hand with the line, "No matter how the winter goes," the 2 deposit slips for birthdays after the initial deposit, and the lined card from Mrs. Lane. My father laid out nothing. He doesn't like paper unless he's the one handing it over. The mediator asked him to describe his decision-making process last spring, and he told her that business doesn't ask if you're ready to make adult choices. It makes you ready by not stopping for your feelings. And that he had planned to refill the account in April, but suppliers had changed their minimums, and it turned into June, and that was outside his control. The mediator asked if he might be willing to set a repayment schedule given the grandmother's stated intent. He looked at the fern for what felt like a full inning, and then said he could do something if it was civilized and not theater. "Write down what something looks like," I said, because my body had learned to put verbs in the room when it wanted to go quiet. And he said he would transfer 1 month of living expenses by the 1st of August and divide the remainder over 4 quarters with Aunt Denise as custodian and the account under my name only. The mediator wrote it, printed it, and asked for signatures, and my hand shook once when I reached for the pen, then steadied as if my fingers had remembered an old exercise. Mediation meant I had a plan that wore paperwork, but that didn't mean the town would politely absorb it. The paper ran Caleb's process story with a line about the chamber adopting a conflict policy and reinstating a scholarship. At the diner, a man who remembers me as the girl who sold him a ceramic frog at the garage sale told his wife, too loud, that kids don't understand payroll. And at church, a woman who used to teach me Sunday school hugged my mother and said how hard it must be when daughters don't realize how much they're loved. Miss Patty offered me a half-hour of extra cleaning each morning, paid in cash, and I took it because cash doesn't ask you questions when you're turning it into laundry and eggs. Zoe finally texted to ask if we could sit at the park near the ball field, and we did. And she looked at her hands more than my face and said her mother thought I had gone too far and that my father must have a reason because nobody wants to look small in public on purpose. That's fair, I said, and I meant it because her mother sits on the PDA board and boards prefer quiet. Zoe added that she thought I had done a brave thing, but she needed to keep her summer simple. And I told her I wouldn't ask her to hold my trouble while she was trying to learn a new routine for the city show they'd booked in August. We said we would text and then didn't for 3 days, which is a kind of truth too. 1 week later, the last Thursday before payday, the chamber sent a polite email confirming that the policy draft would be posted for comment and adding that a neutral accountant had reviewed my grandmother's letter and the timeline and found clear original intent for the CD, and that line made my shoulders drop their inch like someone had turned a key in the right lock. That same afternoon, County Bank called to let me know a payment marked Vaughn Hardware, educational remittance, had cleared to my account, and the teller's voice warmed up by 2 degrees when she said it. And I told her thanks like I was signing for a package I had ordered in a different season. At home, my mother stood at the sink with her hands in soapy water and didn't turn when I came in. She said she had read the policy draft online and thought it sounded sensible. And then she said she didn't remember her mother being this difficult when she wanted something, and I felt my throat go tight because my grandmother used to make tea when conflict looked inevitable and slide a small plate of crackers onto the table like a white flag. And I said, she wrote a letter so we wouldn't have to guess, and my mother nodded once, as if I had just recited a recipe correctly. The big discovery didn't feel like a trumpet. It felt like a folder on a desk at the library, where the reference librarian waited for me with that look older women give younger women when they are happy to see you holding your ground. She had pulled the chamber's annual filings that sit quietly in a drawer no one bothers to open unless they're building a float, and she showed me that my father had been chair of the Education/Youth Committee the year before he became just a member, and that the chair rotates informally along sponsor lines, and that the family who ran the tire shop stepped off after their son got the award last year, and that this is how small towns keep the wheels on by pretending conflict does not exist, while social ties perform the work of rules. It helps to know how the machine expects to turn, she said, sliding the file back into the drawer, and I said, it does, because I now understood that his sentences about weather and roofs came from a long lifetime of other men nodding in rooms that smelled like coffee and eggs while they agreed to take turns. That wasn't a conspiracy. It was habit, and habit is what you have to break with policy if you don't want to end up yelling in the parking lot for the next 20 years. The losses kept coming in polite envelopes. The studio canceled the city show in August because we lost a sponsor who didn't like the tone of the summer. Zoe cried on my shoulder at the back exit and said she was sorry because the girls had worked hard on their routine. And I told her I would teach them the number anyway in the parking lot if I had to, and we both laughed for 2 seconds even though the laugh didn't have a place to sit. My father told the clerk at the grocery store loud enough for me to hear that his daughter was headed to New York to learn about real life, and the clerk smiled a tight smile and handed me my change like a peace offering. And the man in line behind me muttered something about kids and their phones, and I went home and balanced my budget with the new numbers, which included the reinstated local scholarship and the first remittance from the mediation. And I put together a calendar with red circles around each Thursday because that is when worry gets loudest if you let it. I wrote a letter to the landlord in Brooklyn to confirm my August move-in and used the words I had learned this month, documented, confirmation, attached, because paper likes to be spoken to in its own language. When the special meeting minutes were posted, the line adopting the conflict policy landed right where it needed to, essentially dull, easy to skim, impossible to misread. And I printed it and slid it into my folder with everything else because I wanted a spine on this month, something I could hold when I told the story later, and wanted to make sure I hadn't made any of it bigger than it was. The next Sunday, my mother wore her new sandals to church and squeezed my hand during the hymn her mother used to hum while folding towels. And during the coffee hour, my father stood in a circle of men talking about lawn equipment back orders, as if his inbox didn't contain anything complicated. And the pastor asked me quietly how the summer was going, and I told him busy, which was the shortest true thing I could say. At home, the baseball game filled the living room with the kind of noise that lets a house breathe without conversations bumping into sharp corners, and my father kept his eyes on the screen and said, "So you got what you wanted. Are you done now?" And I said, "I asked for rules and repayment. That was all," and he nodded like he had known that all along and was only testing to see if I knew it too. By the last Tuesday of July, the mediator's fern had started to yellow on one side, and I noticed because noticing small changes had become my way of measuring whether I was still present in a room or had drifted off into the story I tell myself about rooms. We signed the final page with the dates and the amounts and the sentence about quarterly remittances with Aunt Denise as custodian, and the mediator shook both our hands like a referee who knows the game must end even if the score leaves nobody cheering. And I walked outside into the heat and felt my shoulders drop again, that inch I had learned to look for. I had not won. I had not lost. I had put paper between me and a man who prefers conversations that evaporate when it suits him, and that mattered more than whether anyone in town decided I was admirable. I drove to the studio, swept up rosin dust that clings to your shoes like sugar, and taught the 8-year-olds to hit their first count with less excitement and more control. And I went home to the couch at Miss Patty's sister's place where the ceiling fan clicks every 5 seconds and the couch smells like fabric softener and someone else's dog. And I lay back and held my phone in both hands and wrote a single sentence in my notes app. Leave on the first Sunday of August. Don't move the date. On the last Thursday of July, I woke before the alarm with my jaw clenched and my tongue pressed against my back teeth because the 1st of August had started to feel like a person tapping their watch at me. And the quiet of Miss Patty's sister's living room held the soft click of the ceiling fan and the faint hum of a refrigerator I had learned to trust. I made coffee that tasted like toasted edges, opened my banking app, and stared at a balance that looked exactly the way it had the night before, which meant the remittance from the mediation had not arrived yet, which meant I had the rest of the day to manage the weight of that fact without letting it drag on everything else that needed moving. At the studio, I swept rosin dust into neat lines while the AM station talked about a thunderstorm possibly building over the county line after 3, and at 9 I taught plies to a line of 8-year-olds who were more focused on glitter socks than counts. And when they ran out to show their mothers their shuffles, I stood at the office counter and stared at the printed mediation schedule like it could explain why transfers act like late buses even when all the signs say on time. Around noon, Aunt Denise called and told me she had reminded my father of the date and the exact sentence in the agreement, and that he had said he was aware, and the way she said aware carried a lot of history in 2 syllables. I walked out to the parking lot hot with July, sat in my car with the engine off, and counted backward from 50 to 10 because counting does not require faith, and then I drove to the bank and asked the teller to check, just in case. And she told me with a sympathetic tilt of her head that nothing had arrived yet, but that the afternoon batch could post as late as 4:45, which made my stomach clench like I had run uphill with a bag of groceries and lost count of the stairs. The Friday before payday does a certain thing to the air in our town, the way ovens heat kitchens in August even when nothing is baking. And by late afternoon the neighborhood was full of people moving hoses around and mowing grass they likely mowed 3 days ago because routine calms the hands. And I set a folding table under the maple in the small front yard of Miss Patty's sister's place with a sign that said moving last items, and I laid out the extra leotards and a couple of framed photos from recitals I didn't need to carry to a new state. People from the block stopped and asked polite questions and sometimes bought things they didn't need for a couple dollars, and at 3:42 my phone buzzed with a text from Aunt Denise, deposit confirmed, and a photo of a receipt with the amount circled in ink and her thumb covering the account number like a habit. My eyes stung in that dry way, relief showing up as a bodily sensation, not a shout, and I wrote back, thank you, because that was all the words I had. At 4 on the dot my father called and his voice did that reasonable thing he uses on customers who want to return a ladder after using it for a weekend, and he said, funds are in. You can check. I fulfilled my part, and I said, I saw, and he said, no need to make a show of it, and I told him I won't, and he switched to that tone that flattens everything into a story he can tell later and added, I'll be by Sunday morning to carry the heavy pieces. I don't want you straining that ankle. And I said, you don't need to do that, and he said, it's my house too, and I didn't argue with that because there was nothing in the room that would benefit from more words. After dinner, which was a sandwich eaten over the sink because there were only 2 plates left unboxed, I walked to the pharmacy for packing tape and saw on the community board a fresh chamber flyer with a line at the bottom that said, conflict of interest policy available upon request, printed in small font, dull as dishwater, perfect. And I stood there longer than makes sense for a person looking at a flyer, because sometimes the only way to take in a win is to let your eyes do the work while your body catches up. Saturday smelled like cut grass and charcoal and sunscreen with a lemon edge, and Miss Patty showed up with 2 studio moms and a van that had seen better Decembers. And we wrapped the small dresser with an old blanket and taped the corners like we were swaddling a very fussy baby. Zoe came by with iced coffee she had paid for with barista tips from the new job she picked up for the summer, and she stood in the shade and handed me a straw and said, "I know we took different paths this month," and the way her lower lip trembled made my throat do the same. And I told her I understood, because loving someone and keeping your head above water are not the same job. Mrs. Lane arrived with a bakery box that smelled like cinnamon and a folded sheet of paper. She pressed the paper into my hand without words, and when I opened it later, it was a typed version of the lined index card she had given me, signed and dated. The kind of detail that keeps the corners straight. A cruiser rolled past slow enough to register and then kept going, and if there was a message in that, it was, "We see you," and for once it didn't feel like a warning. We stacked boxes labeled kitchen on the right side of the van and boxes labeled linens on the left, and when the neighborhood boy who always rides around on a bike with one handlebar taped up offered to help carry, he did it without eyeing the tip jar, which is a small grace. Around 3, a thunderhead built on the edge of the sky and then decided to wander on, and we took that as a sign to call it for the day and leave the last suitcase for the morning. I did not sleep much that night. I lay on the couch with my ankle elevated on a rolled towel the way the clinic physical therapist had told me to, and I listened to someone's baseball game through the thin wall because the late-night rebroadcasts have a quieter energy, the announcer less excited, more thoughtful, and every time I closed my eyes I saw a hallway with varnished floor and a shoe behind my heel and heard a man's short laugh that wanted to be read as humor, and I opened my eyes and looked at the file folder on the coffee table and counted the tabs: bank printout, grandmother's letter in careful pen, mediation agreement, chamber minutes, policy page, Mrs. Lane's statement, and the count settled me more than any prayer I had in my pocket. In the morning, the first Sunday of August rose clear and bright in the window like a good day that had been sitting on a shelf waiting for a person to walk in and say, "Yes, that one," and I ate a piece of toast standing up because the plates were packed. And I left a short note on the kitchen counter thanking Miss Patty's sister for letting me use her couch when I turned the house into a puzzle no one asked to solve. We had agreed to meet at my mother's because the last of my things still lived in that room. And when I pulled up at 8, the church bells down the street were ringing and my mother was on the porch in her Sunday sandals, even though she would not be sitting in any pew that morning. And she hugged me with her hands flat between my shoulder blades like she was steadying a ladder. My father's truck was already in the driveway with the bed empty and the tailgate down as if this were his operation, and he came out carrying the carton-marked books as if his spine had lessons to teach mine, and he said, "We can load heavier items first. It's common sense," and I said, "We've got a system," and he said, "Your systems always sound good until they meet gravity," and I asked him to set the box down and step aside, and he smiled like a man who has put on a shirt for church and knows people are watching. Miss Patty pulled up behind me, and the studio moms got out wearing shorts and t-shirts that could lift without worrying about hemlines, and Aunt Denise arrived with a clipboard like a stage manager, which is what she becomes when we let her. And together they created a rhythm moving from the hall to the van that made my father look like the person who had wandered into someone else's dance without knowing the count. In my room, which smelled like dust and the ghost of the cinnamon candle I liked in winter, I pulled the last tissue-wrapped photo from the top drawer and found under it the spare house key on a ring with a faded fob that says, "Go Tigers." And I slid it into an envelope with a simple note that said, "Returning this," because that was the kind of sentence I wanted to leave behind. He tried once more, near the front door where the light falls just short of the rug, to tilt the morning into a different shape. He said, low and careful, "You can still change your mind. New York doesn't care about you the way we do." And I said, without heat, "It doesn't need to care. I'll do the caring." And he shifted to a tone he uses at the store when a customer is about to walk, and said, "You chose to put family business in public rooms. That has a cost you can't see yet." And my hands went cold the way they do when you have stepped into water you didn't know was that deep. And I told him the only thing I put in public was paper with dates and names, and I placed a thin folder on the hall table, copies of the key pages, the letter, the agreement, with a sticky note that read, "For your records," and the way his mouth tightened told me the words had landed where they needed to land. Outside, Zoe stood by the door of the van biting her lip and asked if I needed anything from the drugstore for the road, and I said, "Just gum," and she vanished and reappeared with mint, and it felt like a successful rescue on a small scale. We were almost done when he tried one more angle, because habits don't fold up neatly. They look for a new corner to push against. He parked his truck across the top of the driveway like a plug, not fully blocking the van, but making the turn thicker than it needed to be, and then he stood with his hands on his hips like a coach telling boys to hustle. Aunt Denise walked right up to him, close enough that another person might have called it unwise, and said in a voice that cut through the morning chatter without getting loud, "Michael, move the truck. This is not your moment." And he didn't move at first, and then he did. And the scrape of the tires on the street sounded like a person writing down a date on a calendar with a pencil that was almost out of lead. We loaded the last box. I hugged my mother and breathed in laundry detergent and her perfume that changes with the season, but always has a powder note. And when my father put his hand on my elbow in a move that has always read to the town as care and to me as pressure, I stepped back and said, "No, just that one word, not a scene, not a fight, just a boundary spoken as if table grace." And he let his hand fall and said nothing because the people who had come to help were watching now without pretending not to. The drive east took hours and tasted like fast food salt and gas station coffee that had been sitting for an extra 20 minutes, and I sang along with the radio to keep my breath moving through my ribs because the highway does a thing to your chest if you let it. And at the state line, my mother called to ask if the tires felt okay and if I knew how to look for the exit on the right without missing the sign. And I laughed and told her, "I can read," and she laughed too, and the sound made my shoulders drop. And then she asked if the first remittance had hit, and I told her, "Yes, we're set for this month." And she repeated "this month" like it was a prayer. In the city, the street we turned onto was narrower than it looked on the map, and the buildings smelled like someone cooked onions and someone else had just done laundry. And my room looked exactly like a room advertised as 8 by 10 looks, white walls, a window that sticks halfway unless you lift and tug, a radiator that will probably behave in winter and misbehave in winter too. But when we put the foam mattress on the floor and set the borrowed desk in the corner and leaned the folder on the shelf so I could see it with the corner of my eye while I moved around, the space felt like a place a person lives, and I stood in the middle of it and felt my knees soften because that is where a lot of my feeling lives. The first week in the city was a list of small tasks measured in dollars and minutes, not metaphors or speeches. Buy a Metro card. Learn which bodega sells eggs that don't smell like the box. Find the laundromat with machines that don't take your quarters and stare back. Show up at the studio desk 15 minutes early and keep my hands flat on the counter when parents complain about shoe sizes. Take the student-teacher class and get told my counts are clean, but my corrections could be kinder. Remember to drink water that doesn't come out of a coffee maker. On the second day, I taught a trial class for 5 little girls who looked at the mirrors like they were meeting cousins, and a mother asked if I had experience with shy kids, and I said, "We start with small 8s and build." And at the end, the mother nodded in a way that felt like a pass. At night, I lay on the foam mattress under a sheet that likes to slide off in the corner and listen to a dog 2 floors down explain his opinion about sirens. And I texted Aunt Denise a picture of the room, and she responded with a thumbs up and we got the Q2 remittance letter. Dates match, and that line gave me enough air to sleep with my jaw unlocked. Back home, the town did what towns do. It folded the summer into a story it could carry without spilling. Someone told me my father said at Rotary that he was proud I had the guts to try the city for a bit. There was a rumor he used the word gumption, which belongs to men who polish it like a coin, and that he made it happen as a father should. And that when someone asked him about the chamber, he said policies shift over time and that's healthy. And the person who relayed this added, he's good at talking to rooms, and I said, I know, and left it there. Miss Patty texted a video of the 8-year-olds doing their parade routine in the parking lot just for themselves because the city show had been canceled, and they were 2 counts cleaner than in May and 1 count short of where I wanted them. And I cried a little and then laughed at myself because crying and laughter live in the same drawer for me. And I sent back a single line that said, tell them to breathe at 4, and she replied with a heart and a already did. 2 weeks in, the chamber emailed a link to the posted policy with the lines that mattered in print. Members must recuse when immediate family is discussed. Votes recorded with names. Scholarship deliberations summarized without informal information. That cannot be checked. It was boring to look at and easy to quote, which is how I knew it would last past the next breakfast with muffins that sweat under plastic. I printed the page at the studio desk on my meal break and slid it into the folder because the spine looked right with one more piece. The same day, my father sent a text for the first time since I left. Hope you're staying realistic. And I stared at the screen long enough to feel my shoulders start to creep back up, and then I put the phone face down and taught my class, and after class I wrote back, hope you're staying on schedule, and hit send before I could edit, and my hands were steady when I did it. He didn't answer, and I understood that as a kind of answer. At the end of that first month, on a Sunday that smelled like rain that never actually fell, I streamed my home church's service on my phone for the first time because I wanted to hear the hymn my mother likes. And I could tell by the way the sound wobbled that someone had set the microphone too close to the speaker, and I smiled because some things are fixed only by a person standing up and moving them an inch, not by a policy or a vote. I cooked eggs on the hot plate. I balanced my budget with a pencil because the math felt calmer when it scratched, and I took out the folder and laid the pages on the desk in order: bank printout, letter, minutes, policy, mediation. And I read them with the window open to the noise of the block and the smell of laundry steam. And when I got to the end, I realized the revenge had not been a spectacle or a perfect bow. It had been this filing system. This refusal to let sentences evaporate when someone wanted them to. This quiet return of things to their proper names. My ribs loosened. My hands did not shake. I picked up my phone and texted Zoe a photo of the studio where I work and asked her how the girls did on the section after the turn, and she replied, no wobbles today, and then she sent a heart and a call when you're free. And the rope that runs between the town and the city felt like something braided and strong, not like a leash. On the last Monday of that first month, after evening classes, I walked home past a bar where a baseball game ran on a TV no one was watching closely. And the announcer talked in that quiet way he uses in the late innings about a pitcher finding the strike zone after a rocky start, and I thought about the hallway behind the stage and the sound my palms made on the varnish. About the short laugh that wanted to turn my life into a joke, and I felt nothing sharp in my chest, only a kind of settled. Like dust choosing a surface. I went upstairs, opened the window with a lift and a tug, set the folder on the shelf where it sits like a little guard, and put my ankle up on a rolled towel while I breathed on an even count. The town would keep talking. My father would keep talking. paper would keep not talking and still saying everything it needed to. When my mother called to say she had mailed me a jar of her spice mix and included a package of napkins because the apartment sounded echoey, I laughed and told her thank you and said I'd send a photo when it arrived, and I meant it. I turned out the light and lay in the yellow glow from the street and listened to a dog 2 floors down complain about nothing and everything, and I let my body go heavy into the foam because that is a lesson this summer has taught me too. When the page is finished and the count is done, you can rest without asking anyone's permission.